I was needing a yellow. And I was needing something with a bit of thickness to it. So I want to start, my work is all about the differences between things, and one of those differences between things is thick and thin paint. I move from thick paint to thin paint very quickly sometimes, and very slowly in other places. Slowly is legato or legato or something like that. Staccato would be very quick next to it. I'm not a musician. I've got to refer to reference for these terms. Okay, so yeah, that's us. I might actually just use this colour to describe some gaps within the clouds and some lit clouds here. It's always a good idea to use, start thinking about, well, introducing the echoing colour around the composition. I like to play, any semi-abstract artist likes to play with the idea of looking at a painting and looking into a painting. I want to have the viewer flip-flop between appreciating the depth and appreciating the surface. And sometimes it becomes more about the surface and sometimes it becomes more about the depth, but it's almost like you can't appreciate the two at the same time. It's a bit like that diagram with the vase and the two faces. So that diagram is a great diagram. It's about negative space and the fact that you can't appreciate one without the other, but if you have good balance, you can appreciate both negative space and positive space to the same amount. You can make your negative space, the gap between the clouds, actually be as important as the cloud itself, and vice versa. And that's really important. There's a piece by Matisse called The Snail. Is anyone familiar with The Snail? Yes. I wanted to have some of these images so you could see them. But the snail, any of my students, and there's none here, I don't think there's any 17, 18-year-olds here, which meant we were all on time. I didn't fall asleep. Yeah, what I say to my graphic design students is there's a similarity with that in the FedEx logo. The FedEx logo has a hidden arrow in it. If anyone's seen the FedEx logo and doesn't know that there's an arrow in it, they haven't appreciated the hidden negative space. The hidden negative space is hidden. And as painters, we want to think about, yeah, we can hide things within negative space, but I like to think more about making the negative space as important as the positive space. And that means that if you're painting a portrait and you've got the head coming here, if you make the head touch the top, you create two bits of negative space, which makes the negative space behind the head more interesting because you split it into two. But if you do split it into two, don't do it in the middle, make one side of the negative space bigger than the other. Now the Matisse piece, The Snail, just takes shapes. He's just cut bits of paper of different colours and stuck them onto a big square thing. The actual size of it is about the height of the ceiling. But he does it in such a way that his angles don't bore you. This angle won't be the same as this angle. They will be different, or else it will be suspicious. This angle should be different from that angle, and it will create a more interesting shape. And I produce skies the way I produce them, not because I want to paint a nice sunset. I'm thinking about shape, negative space, and creating abstract design. Check the time, and then I'll stop talking to you. Right, another 20 minutes on this one, and then move to the next one. Right, I'm going to get going with a little bit more painting here. And it's going to be the idea that these clouds here, they have a red undertone, and then the kind of orangey red undertone, and then on top it's quite purpley or bluish or cool, but it kind of has a halo around it because of the translucency of the outermost parts of the cloud. Has a halo around it. It allows the warm light to pass through the outer border of the cloud. So the way that I'm going to do that, thinking about negative shape and positive shape, I'm going to paint the positive shape in cadmium red with a little bit of light magenta. Forget what that colour's called. It takes ages to dry. What is it? Brilliant pink, Michael Harding. Ages to dry. I'm sending the stuff to Minneapolis, and I nearly couldn't send half of it because I used so much of that stuff. All I'm using this for is a colour reference in the way that shapes transition. So I want to describe the shapes. And I want the distant clouds to be the same colour as the distant hill, because that's just what happens. And sometimes if you get the distant cloud, often you'll see in my paintings, distant cloud overlapping distant hill, in order to break the hard line of the distant hill across your painting, which splits it entirely in half. What I'll end up doing a bit later on is kind of getting rid of an edge, because it's too obvious. It's too obvious a kind of transition. Okay. Just thinking about this as a kind of a base coat. I'm just going to tickle there, just to suggest, just to break up the edge. Break up the edge. Hard edge turns soft. So important. Going from background, negative shape, into positive shape with the same brush, dirty brush, and it's creating that nice transition. Okay, a bit magenta, deepen the darks, intensify the colour. Some people say, or sometimes I say, don't go too bright too soon. I'm not doing that. Don't go too bright too soon, because you'll have nowhere to go. Well, you need to know the rules to break them. All rules are there to be broken, other than possibly fat on lean principles of oil painting, where as long as the thing is not going to crack. All the rules are there to be broken, and the other rule of oil painting, or supposed rule of oil painting, is paint thick on thin, and largely I would stick to that. But once the thing's dry, you can paint thin paint on thick, as long as you're careful and you use the right medium. So now what I'm thinking about is the translucency of this cloud. It's going to be translucent around this light source that I've established is going to be about kind of here. Centre is about here, and that's dangerously close to the centre, but I don't mind that, quite like that, just because I've got this triangular play. The distance between here and here should be, it's quite nice that that's about 2/3 of that. It's quite nice that that distance is different from that distance is different from that distance. Now, you normally have no idea of what hue a colour is until you add a little bit of white to it. I'm just going to add a little bit of white to the edge to see how neutral the colour is. And yeah, it's fairly neutral, but it's going towards the purples, which is going to be a good complement to the blue purples. Are going to be a good complement to what I've got already. And I'm going to suggest some darks in the foreground. And just not nearly enough paint. I like to transition land into sky and sky into land by using soft edges. But I like the idea that light filters down into the land to the point that it becomes completely obliterated by the shadow that's right in front of you. This is more about the concepts of my painting rather than what's literally here, and it's just because I like that flip-flop in between looking at the surface of a painting. What I'll end up doing with this painting is building up the really thick paint within the foreground, echoing some of that within the sky, but running really dark darks down here will emphasize the light better. Light is not light without darkness, and to deepen those darks, and this is just a base coat. This is just kind of base for other marks, more staccato marks to go on top. But what it does do is give you a reference point of how light everything else is. Until you set in your lightest light and set in your darkest dark and do it kind of, at least with the lights, very controlled, you're not going to make good judgment calls on every other colour. You're not going to be quite sure how light something is or how dark something is until you set your lightest light and your darkest dark. So this is roughly the darkest dark. It's not quite the darkest dark because I will get out probably the Mars black. Not today, but I will get the Mars black out, and then you can probably sort of start to figure where the foreground fields will be. So it's just a process of laying down the bricks of what will go on top later. I think that might get the other paper up. Yeah. So the lightest light isn't quite as light as the lightest light. The darkest dark isn't quite as light as dark as the darkest dark. So I've got those really important marks to make at the end. But this is a base I want to work dark to light in the foreground, and I want to work light to dark up here. And I'm going to start laying in the darks just before I switch my paintings. And I'm going to lay in this colour that I've already got mixed. It's always a great idea to try and derive your next colour from your last colour. Strings of colour. To mix, it's quite often a good idea, and I often do it, is pre-mix all the colours, or at least most of the colours that you're going to use, because you mix strings of colour. So a string of colour will be deriving a colour from maybe 2 or 3 colours that you're mixing. So you gradually get more blue, or you gradually get more purple, or you gradually highlight and get lighter each time, so that you've got this progression. So that what that does is it means that you're not falling into the terrible kind of habit of going to white for your highlights. If you mix your highlights, thinking about more than just the value of them, or the tone of them, you've got to think about the colour of them and keeping the translucency. So here we go, I've got a grey here, and this is going to describe